The U.S. drops countries like hot potatoes. That's my whole life, whether it's Vietnam or Afghanistan, now Ukraine.
Jeffrey Sachs basically parrots a lot of Moscow talking points that somehow Russia was threatened by the expansion of NATO.
When you hear this fear-mongering about the Putinists within our government is just ridiculous.
Trying to explain deterrence and spend money for deterrence is always a tough sell.
No way, you're still spending tons of my money on something I don't care about to send over to a nation which is corrupt as hell. Can we just stop BSing each other for a second?
If Russia absorbs Ukraine, they will Russify the people. They will annihilate the Ukrainian identity, turn them into Russians.
Total red herring. Go after
Is the guy who smokes and spends all day arguing with strippers and OnlyFans girls going to speak up?
They make better arguments than you do, bro.
President Trump's State of the Union will be more like a state of the world. Everyone's going to be watching, and Trump's words and decisions are rapidly rewriting the rule book on both historic alliances and present-day emergencies. World leaders rallied to President Zelensky after his White House blowout. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is talking about a coalition of the willing to defend Ukraine's freedom and independence. And maybe that is the blunt reality of America first. The United States is not willing to be the world's police force, at least not unless the world is prepared to pay its way. Many experts have spent the last 4 days fretting about the United States that is suddenly allied with all the wrong people and no longer the leader of the free world. The question we're debating tonight is whether that is true. Does it project American strength or make the free world it created a more dangerous place? And if America really is no longer the leader of the free world, does the MAGA movement care? In a moment, we'll debate with Andrew Wilson, Dave Smith, Ben Hodges and Jake Broe. But first, two big brains who see all this rather differently. The author and political scientist Francis Fukuyama is coming up, and I'm joined first by the economist and public policy analyst, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Professor Sachs, great to have you back on Uncensored, particularly at this moment, which feels like a moment in history. What is your take on where we are post this extraordinary Oval Office shakedown, really, is what went down?
It is a big moment. I think what our new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said a few weeks ago is the key. We are in a multipolar world. I think recognizing that is the first order of us all staying alive to avoid the risks of nuclear war. President Trump said several times that his greatest concern is to avoid World War III. I say bravo on that because we had a lot of neglect of that obvious point for many, many years. So we are in a multipolar world. China is powerful. Russia is powerful. The United States is powerful. If Europe gets its act together, which I hope it does, Europe can be powerful. India will be a great power. That's a reality. Now it's a matter of these great powers not blowing each other up, not getting into a direct war, and also making sure that the rules of the game don't abuse the rest of the world. This is feasible. I think we're on a more realistic course now than we were actually just a few weeks ago.
Do you think we're going to get a peace deal in Ukraine led by Donald Trump? And if so, how do you think this settlement will look?
Well, we know how the settlement will look when it comes, and you can look it up online. There was an April 15th, 2022 draft agreement nearly signed by Ukraine and Russia. If you reread it, as I've done several times in the last few days, it's a good agreement. There were a few details left to be concluded, but basically it was fine. But the United States and UK talked Ukraine out of the agreement, said continue to fight, don't accept neutrality. And unfortunately, since that bad advice, till today, about 1 million Ukrainians have lost their lives or have been gravely wounded. It wasn't good advice. So we know what the agreement will look like. It was already just about agreed.
And so for those who are not up to speed with that 2022 memorandum, how would you summarize it?
Yeah, the agreement was that Ukraine would be neutral, that there would be security guarantees involving all of the great powers, including Russia, which I interpret and would recommend should be through the UN Security Council. There was an annexed map which showed what the territorial lines would be, and this was at the verge of being signed. This, I think, is the basis of an agreement, which is end the war, end the bloodshed, end the destruction. The longer it goes on, the worse for Ukraine. I said that 2 years ago, that any delay meant more loss of life, more devastation. Ukraine would not win on the battlefield, and that's true. Now, Donald Trump is basically saying, look, Biden played poker. He bluffed quite a bit. He thought that the U.S. economic sanctions would bring the Russian economy to its knees. Nope. He thought that the ATACMS and the HIMARS would bring Russia to defeat. He thought that unrest inside Russia would prevent Russia from mobilizing. No, it was a poker game. Trump is saying, I don't want to hold the losing hand. We shouldn't hold the losing hand. And Ukraine only suffers from more poker with a bad hand. Now, Zelensky may be trapped by extremists around him who threaten him maybe with his life or whatever if he makes any concessions. But he says until today, well, there can't be any peace other than the full restoration of Ukraine's territory up to the borders of 1991. It's impossible. It was impossible then. It was impossible in the context of the Maidan coup. It was impossible for anybody who has followed events closely from then till now. And yet Zelensky continues to maintain what is an utterly impossible, literally impossible condition, because if we tried to implement that, well, either Russia would win everything or it would lose, and then it would escalate to nuclear war.
But doesn't he have to, in a way, doesn't Zelensky have to maintain that public position? He can't be seen at the moment, before they've even got round the negotiating table, to be just ceding Ukrainian territory, right? I mean, no leader in that position would.
I would just remind everybody that there were already the negotiations that brought this war nearly to a close 2 years ago. They were real negotiations. I went to Turkey to speak with the negotiators. I've spoken in detail with the negotiators. There was a negotiated end to the war. The United States and UK stopped it. And that's not controversial. That's just how it is, how it's been explained by everybody.
Well, Boris Johnson
involved.
was actually on my show last week and emphatically denied that he was the instigator for Ukraine continuing to fight. He said they wanted to continue fighting.
I don't know if he's the instigator. Maybe I don't think he was the instigator. I think the U.S. was the instigator, but I think he was the messenger.
Making America healthy again is all the rage at the moment. It might be time for you to take charge of your health, as I'm doing with Jacked Up Fitness. Diet and cardio are not enough. You need to do strength training to build up muscle and bone density while burning fat. The Jacked Up Power Rack Pro is an all-in-one home gym system that gives you a full body workout in your spare room or garage. If you're new to strength training, they have a whole library of video workouts, so you can just press play and follow along. Jacked Up Fitness has sent a Power Rack Pro to RFK Jr.'s office in Washington, D.C. in support of making America healthy again. And mine is on its way too, and you'll see the gloating home gym selfies to prove it. If I can do it, you have no excuse. Visit getjackedup.com and use promo code PEERS to start your fitness journey and save 10% on your own. Jacked Up Power Rack. That's getjackedup.com, promo code PEERS. So the assumption would be then that they freeze on the current lines, the 20% that Russia's now occupying of Ukraine, they would keep, albeit, I assume, with no transfer of sovereignty, because Ukraine wouldn't agree to that. That Ukraine would not.
No. First of all, we can't negotiate. This is.
No, I'm asking you what you think is most likely.
Right. Oh, what I think should be done is a permanent peace, not a ceasefire or an armistice line. I don't want to revisit this war and have irredentist sentiments and lobbying for a renewed war and new military buildups and all the rest. I want peace. There should be peace. Ukraine's mistake, but by the way, it wasn't Ukraine's mistake. It was an American project that we've discussed that goes back to 1994, was to push NATO all the way to Ukraine. And that crossed Russia's understandable national security red line. And I would have respected Russia's national security red line because I felt that if you violated it, we would get to where we are today. So I would aim for peace, not a settlement that is grudging, imposed. We never will accept the sovereignty of Russia. What kind of peace is that? All of that is just a prelude to the next war. We should have real peace. By the way, there are three groups of people that are involved or should be involved. They're the generals. They know something about fighting, sometimes well or sometimes badly. They're the politicians. They know something about grandstanding. But then there are the diplomats. The diplomats should work out a real settlement. And while it's not very popular to say, I'm going to say it, the United Nations Security Council should be the ultimate place where that arrangement is settled, including China, including Russia, including Britain, France, the United States, all as co-guarantors of a true peace. Not an armistice line, not a frozen conflict, not something that Ukraine never accepts. No, an end to this war, because we have more important things to do on the planet than have a future in which the question of Lugansk and Donetsk play a central role in somebody's politics.
There are people like Elon Musk calling for America to withdraw from NATO. Just quickly, what is your response to that?
It will happen if there is no settlement of this war. If Europe says, well, I'm all in favor, by the way, of Europe getting its act together. And I was in the European Parliament saying this just very recently.
I agree.
But if Europe says we fight until 1991 borders are restored, the United States will wash its hands of all of this. I can tell you, they will not play a losing hand. They started this, by the way. The U.S. started this. The U.S. said we can go wherever we want. Big Brzezinski laid it all out in 1997 as clearly and explicitly as one can do. So the United States started it, but the U.S. drops countries like hot potatoes. That's my whole life, whether it's Vietnam or Afghanistan, now Ukraine. So if the Europeans push so hard of Zelensky, because for whatever reason, as an individual says what is not in the interest of his country, it could be pretty bad for the relations between Europe and the United States. I would not recommend that at all.
Professor Sachs, great to have you back. Thank you very much.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Well, the author and political scientist Francis Fukuyama is coming up, and I'll also be joined by the rest of my panel, but he's joining me now. Mr. Fukuyama, you've just listened to what Jeffrey Sachs had to say. I have to say he's been very consistent about his position on this from the very start. What is your response?
Well, it's hard to know where to begin. I think he's been wrong about this from the very start. It begins with the fundamental assessment of what Putin wants. Jeffrey Sachs basically parrots a lot of Moscow talking points that somehow Russia was threatened by the expansion of NATO, that it's really NATO that destabilized the situation, and all they're doing is seeking peace. I think that if you listen to what Putin has been saying from the beginning, he is not just interested in security. He regrets the collapse of the Soviet Union. It wasn't just that one statement from the 1990s. He said this in a very long article published before the war. He just celebrated the anniversary of the death of Anatoly Sobchak, saying that he, like Sobchak, this was the most traumatic moment when the Soviet Union fell apart. And if you think that you're going to get peace by any kind of agreement over the current lines in Ukraine, you are wrong, because he wants to reabsorb the whole of Ukraine. He wants to get Moldova, he wants to get Georgia, he wants to get all of these pieces, and then ultimately the Baltics. And so I think that, Jeffrey Sachs is not being realistic about the kind of threat that we are facing.
What should Europe do, given the attitude that Donald Trump and his Vice President J.D. Vance seem to have adopted, which is that Europe has to take the lion's share of responsibility here for dealing with this war now?
Well, this is one area where I actually agree with Donald Trump. I think that Europeans ought to be spending closer to 5% of GDP on their own defense, because America is proving that it is indeed a very unreliable ally, even if the Democrats manage to come back in the next few years. As a European, I would not count on America pulling their chestnuts out of the fire, and therefore they've got to be much more serious about defense cooperation. They got to make much bigger investments in their own defense industrial base, because I think that the threat from Russia is simply not going to cease if there is some kind of a short-term agreement over Ukraine, especially under the conditions that Donald Trump has outlined, where there's basically no Western guarantee that Russia as to what would happen if Russia starts the war again.
You wrote a book called The End of History and the Last Man in 1992. You argued then that the ascendancy of Western liberal democracy, which occurred after the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that humanity had reached not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Given everything that's going on now, are you still as confident that we reach that turning point, irrevocable turning point, or are you concerned that actually that might have been a little premature?
Actually, I did not say either in the original article or the book that it was irrevocable. I said that there's backwards and forwards movement.
Sorry,
yeah,
I may have mischaracterized you. I'm sorry.
No, the real question is there a, first of all, the history I was talking about is not events. It is the broad social evolution of societies. And the question is there a superior form of civilization that is going to supplant Western liberal democracy? And I, frankly, for all of the backsliding that has occurred in existing democracies in recent years, I don't see that higher alternative. I don't think we're all going to look like China in another 50 years, because I do think that people want basic freedom, and I think that they need governments that are restrained by, checks and balances, which is the essence of a liberal democracy. So we're going through a very tough period. There's no question that democracy is threatened. I guess the one thing I really didn't anticipate is that the threat to liberal democracy could be so prominent in the United States itself. That is something I really had not anticipated. But here we are. I think that the international liberal order is being threatened, but I think the liberal order in the United States, and by liberal, I don't mean liberal in the left-right sense as in the United States, liberal meaning the fundamental rule of law, the constraint of checks and balances in a constitutional system. I did not expect that it would come under the kind of threat domestically that it is experiencing today.